Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench.
December 2021, a podcasting duo set themselves a mission to watch and review all 4 of the films in the Dirty Dozen franchise. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dirty Dozen December on Fighting on Film.
Hello, welcome back to Fighting on Film. As the festive jingle says there, it's Dirty Dozen December, and we're going to be covering all of the Dirty Dozen films this month. And what better way to kick off the festive fun than getting stuck into the 1967 classic that kicked it all off. And we're joined this week by Dwayne Epstein, who has written a biography of Lee Marvin called Lee Marvin Point Blank. Dwayne, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We're so pleased to have you, and your insight into Lee Marvin is going to be so interesting on this show. I just know it is. So, Matt, do you want to, I'm sure people are very well aware of what the Dirty Dozen is about, but give people a little bit of a rundown, and then we can get into the cast, the production, all that good stuff.
If you aren't familiar with the Dirty Dozen thus far, and you're listening to a war movie podcast, then I guess you've got a bit of catching up to do, because it's one of the all-time classics, isn't it, really?
Indeed.
It's the original Men on a Mission film. It sees a group of convicted military criminals that are sentenced to either death or long prison sentences, sent on basically a suicide mission behind enemy lines prior to D-Day, headed by Lee Marvin. And it has an all-star cast. We've got Charlie Bronson, Ernest Borgnine, Jim Brown, God, to name a few, a young Donald Sutherland, Clint Walker, Robert Webber.
Telly Savalas.
John Cassavetes.
We're going to dive into the cast a little bit more in a moment, but that's about it. They go on this mission, and it's a pretty shocking mission in the end of things. They're basically tasked with killing as much of the Nazi high command as they possibly can.
Yeah, and then some.
Pretty much.
Dwayne, you're a Lee Marvin expert. So I wonder, just to set some context for the listeners, how big is Lee Marvin's star shining as we go into the production of the movie?
Well, at the time he was asked to be in the film, he had already done Capaloo. It was in theaters. He had just finished shooting another great movie called The Professionals. It was a Western. During the filming of The Dirty Dozen, Robert Aldrich allowed him to fly, because the movie was filmed in England. He allowed him to fly back to LA for the Academy Awards, and he picked up an Oscar. He won for Capaloo, and then he flew back to finish filming The Dirty Dozen. And I'd like to point out where he was at the time. He was in this wonderful place in terms of the films he made in a short period of time, from about the early to mid-'60s to the early 70s, where he did a string of incredibly great action films, and probably The Dirty Dozen was the best of them. But that aside, when The Dirty Dozen came out in mid-1967, he had 2 films in theaters at the same time. He had that, and he had Point Blank. And consequently, it made him the #1 male box office star in the country. I don't know where he was in terms of international popularity, probably pretty high, but he was it. And The Dirty Dozen, consequently, was also the #1 box office film of the year. And it got mixed reviews because it was extremely controversial, especially the ending that you had mentioned a moment ago, Max. And a lot of people believe that because Robert Aldrich, the director, did not want to change the ending in any way, it may have robbed him of an Oscar nomination, because he was probably on track to get a Best Director Oscar nomination. Probably would have won, although it was a very, Frank Sinatra would say, it was a very good year. The year of The Graduate, Bonnie and Clyde, Cool Hand Luke, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? A lot of great movies, a lot of classics. And
yeah,
The Dirty Dozen was the most popular of that entire group.
I mean, wow. What more can you say there, really? So, Matt, do you want to talk more about the cast for us?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, it's a pretty strong cast in terms of war movies of that era, isn't it? Really, you've got Lee Marvin, who is at his peak. He's a powerhouse in this. He He honestly is the standout in this, but it is a strong cast. I love Charlie Bronson's role in this as well as Vladislav.
He's great.
And Jim Brown, these are just my personal favorites I'm picking up, but we'll go into the rest of them in a moment. I really like Jim Brown's role in this, and I think if I'm right, this is the movie that Jim Brown retired from NFL for, isn't it?
Apparently so.
Yes, indeed it is. During the making of the movie, he held a press conference announcing his retirement because the owner of the Cleveland Browns, I believe his name was Art Modell, I think, had the filming production schedule went longer because of the amount of rain that was going on. And they...
in England? Surely not.
Yeah, what a shock, right? Art Modell said that if Jim Brown isn't back on time in America to start practice, he's going to be fined I think $100 or $1,000 a day, something like that. And Jim Brown said, all right, fine, I quit. I retire. And he's on the record as saying it didn't bother him to retire. He just didn't like getting an ultimatum and being told, if you don't, we're going to do this kind of deal. He hated that. So he just up and retired while the movie was being made. It wasn't his first film, by the way. He had made a small budget Western like a year or two before called Rio Conchos. But once he was in The Dirty Dozen, and The Dirty Dozen was such a hit, there's an amazing thing about that movie in that it launched the major careers of so many people that were in it. From that film on, Jim Brown became a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? An icon in terms of black cinema. There had never been a screen presence like his in American films before. And there was Sidney Poitier, there was Woody Strode, there was Paul Robeson, and Sidney Poitier always kind of represented a rather sophisticated intellectual African-American. Woody Strode was strong and noble, whom, by the way, I got to know and was a wonderful, wonderful guy. But Jim Brown was the first black presence on screen to say, this is who I am. I'm going to be tough. I'm going to be macho and masculine. And if you don't like it, too damn bad. That's your problem. He was probably American cinema's first black badass. That would be the best way to say it. And, Charles Bronson was always a second lead for almost his entire career. But after The Dirty Dozen, he stayed in Europe and made some more films. And those films he made in Europe were some of the best films he ever made. And Once Upon a Time in the West, Rider on the Rain, Someone Behind the Door, Cold Sweat. It launched his superstardom with The Dirty Dozen. John Cassavetes, who is my personal favorite in the film, other than Marvin, John Cassavetes had been kind of blacklisted in Hollywood for the last couple of years because he got in a major fight with Stanley Kramer, and consequently, he couldn't get any work. When he got talked into doing The Dirty Dozen, he not only got a Best Supporting Actor Oscar nomination, it allowed him to finish the film he had been working on, but he couldn't get financing for, a movie called Faces, which also got several Oscar nominations. And then it launched his independent filmmaking career, and he's often been called the father of American independent film. So, the result of The Dirty Dozen on people's careers was fascinating to me. And they went off like rockets. It was great.
Yeah. I mean, look at Donald Sutherland, what he goes on to do.
He's another good example. Donald Sutherland said in interviews that it was his performance in The Dirty Dozen that got a few years later, but it was directly responsible for him getting the lead in the movie MASH, which
of course
made him a star.
Exactly. I think the director of the recent Suicide Squad movie, James Gunn, he said in a press interview that this movie is like the Suicide Squad of its day. It's that ensemble.
Oh, absolutely.
Having these big ensemble casts with your Avengers films and your superhero movies. But I guess for back in the 60s, this is quite a rare event. So to get all these big names in a film, you can see why it's so heralded and beloved.
Well, a couple of things, just real quick, if I may.
Sure.
You mentioned James Gunn a moment ago, and also a writer-director named David Ayer. They both said Suicide Squad was a direct result, directly influenced by The Dirty Dozen. And about a year or two ago, it had been announced that they were going to do a remake of The Dirty Dozen. I don't know where it's at this point, but that was announced. Now, in terms of big budgeted, big all-male ensemble casts, there were a lot of them in the 60s. I mean, it might have started with like The Longest Day.
Of course. Yeah. Sorry. Where am I thinking? Yeah.
No, that's quite all right. And they were, the 60s was an interesting time period for, I don't want to call them buddy films or macho films, but the World War II was an extremely popular subject. There was Orion's Express, Where Eagles Dare, The Devil's Brigade, which was a direct ripoff of The Dirty Dozen. And there was a small film that Roger Corman, I don't know if you're familiar with Roger Corman, had made called Secret Invasion. And according to Corman, the plot was almost identical to The Dirty Dozen. And he claims the producers of The Dirty Dozen held up the release of the film for a year so as to avoid any confusion with the film that he made. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily true or not, but it's an interesting apocryphal story if it is. And by the way, before I go any further, I just wanted to point out, as I had mentioned to you gentlemen, 2 or 3 weeks ago, the timing of this is amazing. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, I just got the go-ahead for a book publishing deal about the making of The Dirty Dozen. It's called Killing Generals.
Great name.
For the most obvious of reasons.
Yeah, it's Bronson's line at the end, isn't it? It's one of the best lines in the film.
Boy, oh boy, killing generals can get to be a habit with me. I love that line.
I think my favorite little tidbit before we go into production is that I only recently realized it, but the movie Small Soldiers, the commando elite are voiced by the surviving cast, and I just I just love that film when I was little. But to now know that it was most of the Dirty Dozen, it sort of really makes sense now.
Yeah, I have to tell you a great story about that. I was able to interview Clint Walker, and super nice guy also. Clint Walker told me that story about how when they were making The Dirty Dozen, Trini Lopez asked for more money, and he got written out of the film, as you know. And what happened was many years later, when they were doing Clint Walker told me this, when they were doing Small Soldiers, the director, Joe Dante, approached the surviving cast members of The Dirty Dozen to do the voices. And Lee Marvin had already passed, so Tommy Lee Jones, who could practically be considered a Lee Marvin lookalike, he did the lead character voice. And so Clint Walker said, and I asked him, how come Trini Lopez wasn't asked? And Clint Walker said, we did ask. He just said no because he wanted more money. It's like, you think the guy would learn from his mistakes. But they did get Ernest Borgnine, they did get Jim Brown and George Kennedy and Clint Walker, and it's wonderful.
And is it the lads from Spinal Tap or the Gorgonites? I remember rightly.
Yes. And Frank Langella, the great character actor, played the lead Gorgonite.
Yeah, that's it. So I mean, we'll just quickly run through production, and because it's a great, the crew of the movie is just fantastic as well. So you've got director Robert Aldrich. He's known for Sahara, Too Late the Hero. He'd worked with Lee Marvin on Attack as well. Screenplay by Nanali Johnson and Lucas Heller. Cinematography, Edward Safey, I think. Music by Frank Diavol. And it's based on a book from 1965 by Erwin Nathanson, but it was also inspired by the 101st Airborne's demolition specialists, and they were known as the Filthy 13. And you see the famous photo of them shaving their hair into mohawks with the war paint on, one of those sort of iconic images of the Normandy campaign from the American paratroopers' point of view. Filmed for $4.5 million, and it grosses 45.3. So that's quite a big profit. 4 Academy Award nominations, and it wins for Best Sound Effects by John Poyner. I think that's how you say that one. And I have a retro review this week from the Daily Mirror, the British newspaper, from Friday, the 22nd of September, 1967. The reluctant heroes and American brass hats considered the mission they wanted carried out just before D-Day was too dangerous for decent GIs. So 12 soldiers under sentence of death or awaiting long terms of imprisonment were recruited for the task. This ingenious idea is a springboard for a lot of exciting, if at times laughably incredible, adventures in The Dirty Dozen. Lee Marvin is excellently cast as Major John Reisman, a chip on the epaulet officer with no time for conventional army discipline. Reisman is considered just the man to turn the 12 criminals into a dedicated crowd killers. They're tasked to parachute into Occupy France and wipe out a score of high-ranking Nazis. They managed to make a highly entertaining slice of wartime heroics. Sums it up, really.
Pretty much.
It really does. Filmed in England mainly, on the MGM studios in Boreham Wood, and the town that is used for the training montage is the town of Albury, and the scene where they do their parachute training and Sutherland makes a mockery of Robert Ryan's breed is RAF Hendon.
It's funny, just before we started this, I just got off the phone with the film's producer. He's still alive.
Oh, wow.
He's 93 years old, Ken Hyman, and sharp as a tack. Great story. It was his idea to film it in London. He said it would not be cost effective to film it in California, even though a lot of it's not a matter of being cost effective. Let me restate that. It was
Sure.
it would be more believable to film it in England, where in California, you know, the reason why Hollywood was chosen as a movie making capital was because there's so many different environments here in California, mountains, forests, beaches, you name it.
Sure.
But for the purposes of the movie, The Dirty Dozen, he just thought, you know, England would be best, and the majority of it was filmed there. And he tells some great stories about the making of the movie. Super nice guy too, by the way.
Of course, because obviously at that time in the war, the Americans are there staging, preparing, training for the Normandy invasion. So it makes complete sense. And I think it didn't really hit me, so I've seen it a few times, but it actually it looks great as well. All those countryside shots look really nice.
Absolutely.
You know, you've got the prison looks really imposing, and you know, when they're out in that field in the middle of nowhere, it works. You know, it really looks great.
Yeah, the mise en scene's quite good. But you get that establishing shot of Marvin arriving at the prison, and there's some nice shots of the exterior, and then when he's arriving to speak to Borgnine's character, Major General Warden, you get that great street shot, and it's got
and they got the barrage balloons in the background, and it's very believable.
It is. They go to a little bit more lengths than, you know, some of the films of the period. That's for sure.
Sure.
Yes.
So, Dwayne, when they were filming the movie, did they know that they wanted to have such an elongated sort of like training, element to the film?
As far as I know, indeed, and that served a very strong purpose. And I have to tell you, one of the problems a lot of film critics had with the film when it came out wasn't just a matter of a violent ending. It was a matter of plausibility. And they raised that issue several times in the film itself with some of the dialogue, in that it just was not believable that the army would spend so much time and energy training a bunch of psychopaths. You know, they're psychopaths. You're not going to be able to train these guys. So especially the war games sequence, which is how they tried, the characters prove themselves. That also stretched believability a certain amount as well, in that they just broke all the rules. That's all they did. They were changing the color bands. They lied about where they were going and what they were doing. They stole stuff. And that wasn't the purpose of the war games. However, what it did was it bonded them as a unit, and it allowed the brass to realize these guys are capable. They can do what we want them to do, and they can probably do it better than commandos that we already have. And I'm guessing their thinking is, if we use highly trained commandos to go into a suicide mission, we're going to waste a lot of men. Why not use a bunch of guys who aren't going to be worth much anyway? We don't like them. They're due to be executed. So maybe that was the thinking. But if you remember early on in the film, Lee Marvin says to Ernest Borgnine, when he first gets told about what the mission, he says, I don't think it's a good idea to let it out. That's a little assumption I've had for a long time. And Borgnine said, would you mind sharing that with us? And Marvin said, yeah, that somewhere up there, we're working for a raving lunatic. That this whole idea is insane. And then after Marvin leaves, Borgnine says to Robert Webber, he's right about one thing: somebody up there is absolutely nuts. The whole premise is nuts, but they make it work. It makes stretch believability, but they make it work.
Oh yeah, you can definitely sort of imagine this sort of thing happening. So many incredible things happened during the war, that them gathering a dozen hardened criminals, some of them psychopaths. You can imagine that going down. Yeah. Someone going, we've got a mission, and we need a particular type of soldier to do this. Obviously, with such a long training sequence, and we get to know maybe 5 of the characters quite well, and the rest are sort of background actors, and everyone gets like 1 or 2 scenes, even the lower down people like Tom Busby's Vladek and such. But the key characters are Bronson's character, Jim Brown's character, John Cassavetes, to a degree, Richard Jekyll's, and then obviously Telly Savalas is impressive as a psychopath.
Yeah,
he carries that so well, doesn't he?
It's interesting because in the book, his character, Archer Maggot, Maggot was, in the book, a Southern racist. However, there were also two other characters, one who was a sexual deviant and another who was a religious fanatic. And what they did in the movie was they combined all three of those characteristics into one character, into Maggot. And Telly Savalas plays it exactly as he should. He's a racist, sexually deviant, religious fanatic. all in one guy.
What a mix.
Right, yeah, exactly. But I think for me, it's a little bit far removed because he's like a comedic guy. So it was for me like watching him, and I'd seen him in mainly comedic roles, Big Joe and the tank commander he plays in Battle of the Bulge.
Also in Kelly's Heroes too.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So then when you see him playing this absolute villainous creep, it's such a great turn from Telly. I think he's my, it's bad to say my favorite because of the sort of heinous crimes the man's committed, but he's like my favorite one of the Dirty Dozen just because of the performance. I really like. It's
interesting.
It's impressive.
In acting terms, it really is.
Mine is Cassavetes. I think Cassavetes, if it's possible for him to steal a cast in such a big movie, Cassavetes does it. He commits grand larceny. He steals every single scene he's in. I think he's wonderful. My favorite character. Maybe because I've actually known guys like that. I think we've all, not to that extent, but I think we've all known
I think you're right.
punks in our lives.
Yeah, true.
He's a punk. He's a big ass punk. He sticks his nose in where it doesn't belong. He's always, constantly provoking everybody else in the cast, especially Marvin. And he's my favorite. Always has been.
Matt, who's your favorite Dirty Dozen member?
You know what? It's really hard to pick, to be honest, isn't it? I mean, we all love Lee Marvin in this movie. I love Lee Marvin as an actor, but you've got to like think you've got Clint Walker, who has a really interesting little role, and he kind of gets sort of forgotten towards the end of the movie. But then you got George Kennedy as is it Major Armbruster? And he's sort of like friends with Marvin, and he brings that slight sort of bemused comedic element to it. And
which the same year he did Cool Hand Luke, which he did win the Oscar for. He beat out Cassavetes, interestingly enough.
Wow.
And you've got Robert Ryan as well, who I believe was in The Professionals with Marvin as well, wasn't he?
Yep.
And he plays the stiff officer so well.
Yeah.
And that scene at the air base where Marvin says to him, "Well, I knew you were stiff, but I didn't know you were emotional too." I'm paraphrasing there, but that scene, it's just so good, and
you're really quite emotional.
Ryan's face is just priceless.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree.
So, chaps, I think we should move on to the Alley Tally. Talk about some of the kit and equipment.
Yeah.
It's time for Alley Tally on Fighting on Film.
That reminds me, I want to show you something.
Sure.
I don't know if you guys can see this or not. Here's a copy of my book, by the way.
Yep.
Paperback. Now, one of the first photos, I don't know if you can see that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I believe that's a grease gun, and that's a scene.
It is.
Yeah, that's the scene in the movie when Marvin gets the jump on Ryan, who has broken into the camp. Now, I don't know if you can see it, but you see the magazines, the cartridges? Yep. Okay. How one is taped to the other. So when one gets empty, you pop it out and you put it back in again. You turn it around and put it back in. That was Marvin's idea. Lee Marvin had been in the Marines in World War II.
Yes, of course.
He was wounded on Saipan, so he knew weaponry very, very well. And matter of fact, on several films he had made, and I'm assuming this would have been one of them as well, he was kind of unofficially put in charge of the weapons that were used in the film, because they were in the Professionals, because they were shooting in the Valley of Fire desert in Nevada, which was very dusty and dirty and hot. He and a stuntman friend of his, Tony Epper, took it upon themselves to keep the guns clean, because nobody on the movie set knew how to do it. And I assume he did the same with the Dirty Dozen.
Yeah, he's got that great shotgun in the Professionals, doesn't he? He's got that trench gun. Yeah,
right, absolutely. Yeah. He knew weapons better probably than any other actor in movie history, and he handled them so well. You know, he could do things with his hands that were perfect for the movies, kind of theatrical, and yet he knew what he was doing and how to be careful when he was doing it. He was brilliant that way.
So Dwayne,
Yes,
as you're the guest, you get first pick. And would you say that the grease gun is your pick for the alley tally?
In terms of the props that are used, I would say that or the half track that was used at the end of the film to go over the bridge. That thing is amazing, man.
Oh, yeah, that's a doozy. It's a DB10 SDKF 2.8, I believe.
Rob's done his research.
Yeah. But I think it's funny because they choose one of the slowest vehicles in that motor pool to try and get away.
And the fact that it's carrying, pulling the Bofors gun at the back, and Lee Marvin kind of gives Franco that look where he's like, really?
Yeah. You believe these guys keep these things locked? And he finally hotwires one. Apparently, I found out that when they were filming that sequence, there was a great story Ken Hyman told me that it was one of the last scenes they needed to shoot. And Bronson was really, really anxious to get back to California because he was having some domestic issues that I don't want to get into. But anyway, Marvin could not be found that day. And Bronson was getting more and more pissed off. Ken Hyman went looking for him, and he kind of figured he knew where he'd be because after a day shooting, Marvin always wound up in the same pub. I guess Marvin got the schedule wrong or thought they were done or whatever. But when Hyman went to the pub, he goes, there was Lee. He was sitting on the floor, drunk as can be, singing to himself. And he said, Ken Hyman told me, I crooked my finger at him. And I was like, Lee, you got to have to come with me. And he said, I poured him into the limo. I kept shoving coffee into him. We got to the movie set. Lee fell out of the car. Bronson looked at Marvin and went, Lee, I'm going to fucking kill you. He was so pissed off. And Ken Hyman ran up to Bronson and he told me I had to act like the head of the UN. He said, I put my hands on Bronson's chest and I said, Charlie, please don't hit him in the face. We got close-ups. Hit him in the body, whatever, but don't hit him in the face. So Bronson eventually calmed down.
I love that.
Somehow they got the shot, and that's really Lee Marvin driving that thing. As drunk as he was.
Thank God it's so slow and cumbersome.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely right.
For me, it's got to be the chateau set. They built that from scratch to blow up. And I mean, by gosh, it goes up, doesn't it? But I think it just still really holds up. It's that whole practical effects thing over CGI, everything's intentional. It sells that whole end sequence. I can imagine the German top brass purloining this beautiful chateau for all their high and mighty.
Right.
And when it goes up, a satisfying explosion, it's just what you want at the end to sort of tee off your big set piece. I mean, that's
what you shouldn't do though, is put your ammunition dump underneath your headquarters. That's always a bad idea. Minor design
flaw.
Yeah, but not for the Allies. It worked out great for them.
No, of course it did. Yeah. I can't get away from not mentioning that the Germans are using Bedford QLT truck and a Bedford QL, and I think both get blown up. I think, don't they? One of them does.
Yes, they do. Yeah, Clint Walker and
Al Mancini.
That's it. Thank you. They're in that weapons pit at the front, just laying down machine gun fire, while everyone else is
absolutely giving it
pouring gasoline down on the Germans. They're just absolutely slaughtering that relief column.
Posey in that scene uses a Webley and Scott Mark III Star signal pistol, which you just don't see a lot of them, do you, Matt?
Oh, the flare, yeah.
You don't see flare guns and single guns, unless they have a specific plot point. And obviously that was a warning that, the Germans were coming. But
right.
Yeah, I think for me, obviously, Dwayne, you've already mentioned the jungle magged grease gun. And as you say,
iconic.
Marvin was a Marine. There were a lot of, former servicemen on this picture.
Yes.
Robert Webber, Robert Ryan, Telly Savalas, George Kennedy.
Ernest Borgnine.
Bronson had been in. Borgnine, obviously, in the Navy. Jekyll and Clint Walker have both been mentioned Marines.
That's right.
So everyone's super, believable and on it. And, everyone else is just having fun being, hardened criminals, I think. And it all works so well. Talking
to Ken Hyman, he told me that he also, behind the camera, Ken Hyman was a Marine in Korea. And he told me during the Korean War, he was stationed in Quantico, Virginia. But he told me that when he approached Marvin about playing the role, Marvin agreed. But then he asked him, weren't you in the service? And Hyman said, yeah. And what rank were you? And Marvin said he was a PFC. Hyman said, I'm a corporal, so I'm going to pull rank on you. When I tell you what to do, you got to listen. He was a corporal. I love stuff like that.
Didn't Lee have trouble sort of like retaining rank? Wasn't he a corporal and then a private and then a corporal and then a private again?
Yep. I interviewed Lee's career-long agent a few years before he passed away, a gentleman named Meyer Mishkin, and they used to joke about it. Meyer Mishkin said, how long were you in the service for? And he said, I think it was in for like 3 years. And then before he got wounded. And Mishkin said, how come you never got made sergeant? And I think Lee's reaction was, I made sergeant plenty of times. I just kept getting busted. That was his comeback.
Love it. Well, it shows, doesn't it? And as you say, the way he holds that grease gun when he hops down off that roof, it's pointed in a safe direction. But Jesus, does he not look cool holding it like on his hip like that?
Yeah,
it just
absolutely.
It's quick. It's the iconic image of the movie, really, isn't it?
It really is.
I agree completely.
The combat experience with taping up your magazine like that, that's cool in itself. But in terms of some other picks from me, I would say an interesting one is the German sniper rifle, which is a K98K, and it has that sort of night vision scope. And that's kind of based on something that was real, but obviously the scope that we see in the film is much smaller than what Vampire scope would have been capable of, because they were big things. And the other thing, I just love the little Beretta that Bronson has, and he when he starts killing Germans quietly. The only other thing, vehicle-wise, would be the Daimler Dingo that's mocked up to look like a German fighting vehicle.
It's just got a huge like lip thing on the top of it.
Yeah, and it's the one that manages to get past Clint Walker at the front.
I was just going to ask. I didn't know that's what it was called. I was going to ask you, since you gentlemen are discussing all these things that were used in the film, has one person in it, and it has like a shield. The German officer is in it.
The Daimler Dingo, British armored car, but they've mocked it up as a German
I'll
one.
be damned.
Yeah.
See, you learn something new every day. Cool. I didn't know that's what it was called.
Great to see it though.
Make sure you put that in the book.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And all the lads are in there like M43 jackets and stuff. They all look great in it. Lee. I mean, who doesn't look cool in a tanker's jacket? Lee looks cool as in this movie.
Well, I have to tell you, aside from knowing weaponry so well, I don't think any other actor looked as good in a uniform as Lee Marvin.
Yeah, he does look fantastic, doesn't he? I think that brings us on to fave scenes, doesn't it, really?
Hello there, sorry to interrupt. I wanted to let you know that you can now join our supporting cast over on Patreon. As thanks for your support, you'll be able to help us pick films, submit questions for guests, have first pick on brand new and exclusive merch, and much more. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show. So, Dwayne, you're our guest. What's your favourite scene? If you can pick one.
I've got far too many. One of them is when, like I said, pretty much any scene that Cassavetes is in. But when early on, when Bronson and Jim Brown stop him from escaping, when he cuts the barbed wire, he's such a bastard in that scene. What he says to them, he looks at Jim Brown, who just slapped the wire cutters out of his hand, and Cassavetes looks at Jim Brown and he goes, "What is this, Uncle Tom week?" I'm like, "Oh man, he's just begging. He is just begging for an ass kicking." And also, the scene with Donald Sutherland when he's supposed to be a general and he's inspecting the troops. I found out that Donald Sutherland was a last-minute choice to do that. That it was originally, I think it was either going to be John Cassavetes to do it, or I think maybe Clint Walker. But at the last second, Robert Aldrich had seen Donald Sutherland and the way he was reacting, I think, to different things. And he looked at Donald Sutherland and he said, "Hey, you with the big ears, you want to try doing this?" And he did it in rehearsal, and Aldrich loved it. And it's hysterical the way he plays that.
I can't imagine anyone else doing that scene. Really, I mean, that's probably the scene that catapults Sutherland in this, isn't it? Really, that's the film that everyone remembers. The scene everyone remembers from the film.
And watching everybody else in that scene when he's going up and down, and Lee Marvin had instructed, Reisman had instructed him, saying, "You've seen generals inspect troops, just up one lane, up one aisle, and down the other. Walk fast, look dumb, and act stupid." And he keeps stopping. And every time he does that, you see Lee Marvin kind of go, and then he asks one soldier where he's from, and just and makes fun of.
Never heard of it.
That's right.
It's really great. Love it. It's funny.
Addison City, Missouri, sir.
That's the one.
Yeah, and I love it when he turns to Robert Ryan and he goes, "Mighty pretty, Colonel, mighty pretty. But can they fight?"
Yeah.
Obviously, Pinkley, the character of Pinkley, who is an idiot, let's face it, he's a moron. He had seen generals do this before, and that's what he was doing. He was making fun of the guys he had seen do that previously. So, yeah, I love that scene.
The band leader in that scene is also great. Like, he needs a little shout out.
Not now.
Yeah.
It's classic. It's that classic humor to it.
Well, I have to tell you something, too. A friend of mine and I used to watch The Dirty Dozen all the time when home video first came out. And he pointed out something about that scene that's a little unsettling. And I think it's on purpose. Look at the way Robert Ryan wears his pants. I mean, he's wearing the Ike jacket and he's got tight slacks on, but his pants from the back are a little bit overly tight and you can see his panty line. And I think it's an attempt to try to make him look slightly effeminate next to overly macho Lee Marvin.
Interesting.
Next time you watch it, check it out.
Yeah, he gives off a little bit of, Patton vibes a little bit, doesn't he? He's
very, very much so.
Yeah, those sunglasses are definitely not 1940s either, though, are they?
Bit Ray-Ban-y, aren't they?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
Matt, your favorite scene?
My favorite scene is when Lee and Bronson are sort of infiltrating the chateau, and neither of them can speak German. That makes complete sense. Send the guys that don't speak German in.
Bronson's character is supposed to be able to, but obviously he makes the point that it had been a while since he had actually spoken it. He says early in the film that he grew up, which I think they did this just for him because it was very similar to Bronson's own personal life, that he grew up in a poor mining town in Pennsylvania. But Bronson's character, Waterslaw, said, well, Lee Marvin asked him, how come you speak German? He said, because my old man was a coal miner in Silesia. He didn't speak German. He didn't dig coal. We didn't eat. And that's why he is with Marvin when they infiltrate the chateau. But he proves a couple of occasions he doesn't really know German as well as he thought he does.
No, they don't. Didn't say much, that's for sure. So they kind of get in there, and there's that receptionist sort of chap on the door that has them signed in the ledger, and he has some great reaction close-ups throughout this whole sequence where it keeps cutting to him. He's watching them walking through this party, and he's like, "This is weird. Like those two are definitely not quite right." And he never says anything though. He's one of the guys at the end that sort of get captured.
Yeah, Bronson's character and also Richard Jacob Bauer, they both get shot in the leg in different sequences.
Yes,
but they both get wounded. And of the 12, Bronson is the only survivor. That's a spoiler alert for anybody who hadn't seen the film.
He is. If you've gotten this far and that was the worst spoiler you've had on the podcast, then you're in trouble. But yeah, so I love that scene because they sort of make their way through the chateau and we get this whole sequence of them putting their bags in the room, and then they do that thing that everyone does when they go into a room and they just sort of like stop and look around the room. When you get to a hotel
they're
room,
going to stay there.
Yeah. It's like a married couple sort of thing, isn't it? Where they're like,
not bad.
And then they just start killing Nazis.
When they go into the party area where everything's going on, I love Bronson's line. He has a throwaway line. He picks up a pamphlet or something and he's reading it. And he says to Marvin, "Gee, I wish I could read this. I think it's dirty." It's a great line.
But there's a lot of like physical acting in that with Marvin, and he's basically sat in that chair and the drunk German sort of proselytizing to him, and Marvin's there like trying not to make eye contact, but sort of non-committally going, until a guy goes away. What about you, Rob?
The training sequence, the training exercise that they do before the mission, because there's parts of the movie where I'm thinking, oh gosh, okay, where are we going here? Because I think sometimes it's a little bit too long in places. But the training sequence is really good for me because they get to prove themselves. So they get to prove not only to the army themselves, but they get to prove themselves to the viewer that they can do this death-defying mission. So, they outsmart everyone. They're changing the armbands, the stealing of the ambulance. It's like a heist, that's how I kind of see it.
It absolutely is. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. They're trying to capture it's what Reisman says in the HQ. He goes, they'll knock out Breed's HQ and capture his entire staff. And that's exactly what they do. And they do it with cunning and nous. And, Bronson comes through as this sort of NCO type character, shows himself as being dependable. Everyone else gets their little moment as well. And it's the first time in the movie where you think, these lads might actually be able to pull it off, because before that, they're sort of bumbling, they haven't shaved, they're angry, reluctant, they don't know why, they hate the fact that they've been chosen. And then they do get to prove themselves. And I kind of like that Ernest Borgnine sort of, he cottons on halfway through of what they're doing. And he sort of like has a little wry chuckle and a smile to himself. And it's sort of where the movie just comes together.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. But can I point out one thing that's always bothered me about that movie, about that particular sequence?
Of course.
Borgnine figures out that these guys are not really who they say they are, and he smirks to himself and giggles, and he realizes if he stays there, he's going to be captured too. So he gets up and leaves. Now, he figures it out because he sees the guys who were supposed to have been wounded. Clint Walker's laying on the stretcher, and the other guys are like attending to him. He sees them take a bunch of stuff out of their pack, and they look like, at first I always thought they were thermometers. They're not. They're what you call it?
Detonators.
Detonators, thank you. They're detonators. And when Borgnine sees those detonators, he realizes these guys are not who they say they are. How does that prove it? I've never been able to figure that out.
How are they going to capture the general with a load of detonators? They're not going to blow him up, are they?
He just knows. I think he figures out that that these guys are not who they say they are, and they're gonna do something to breed. And if they're gonna do something to breed, I don't want to be around for that because they may capture me too. I think that's what he figures. But how does the detonators give it away?
Yeah, I totally get it. But for me, how does Borgnine not know who these guys are? Because surely if he's involved in the mission, he's got a dossier on all these guys and what they've done and who they are. It just...
Well, he's also agreed to let these guys prove themselves at this divisional exercise. So he knows this is going to happen. Well, if we're going to mention a bit that doesn't quite make sense, there's a little line in the chateau sequence where Telly Savalas is getting that lady to scream, and there's a reaction shot from the general, and he goes, "Sounds like someone has pre-invasion nerves
or ecstasy."
Yeah, or ecstasy. Yeah. So at that point, I was like, the Germans, they know there's an invasion coming, like within the next 48 hours, and they're having a party.
The only date they could get, Matt. It's the only date they could get.
It's been planned long in advance.
Yeah, I think they didn't know when the invasion was going to be, but they knew an invasion was coming. That's probably the best way to put it.
Yes, that benefit of the doubt is that is that definitely. Yeah.
It's I think it's just. I think that whole training sequence is just fun. It's just a fun part of the film,
And speaking of fun, don't you love that scene when John Cassavetes flips Al Mancini over his shoulder, and then Clint Walker walks up and he goes, "Ooh, tough on the fella. You want to try that with me?" And Cassavetes is like, "Ha ha!" And he runs away. I love that.
I love the first scene where Marvin and Cassavetes have, where he confronts him in the prison yard, and Marvin flips him with such ease.
Yeah.
That's a cool scene. Go on, Dwayne. What are the scenes do you love? Because it's guests' prerogative. You can have far more than one or two.
Well, in that case, that sequence that I just said, the one that you pointed out about the training scene, and I love at the end when they go through the and I never thought of this before until fairly recently, when they have the celebratory dinner the night before they go out for the mission, and they're all sitting at a table, and Marvin's at the head of the table in the middle, and he's standing, and then he says, "All right, let's go through it again. Number 2, the guards are through." Franco goes in where the others have been, and they're doing it by the numbers. The way he's standing and the way they're looking at him, okay?
Yeah.
He's Jesus, and there's 12 disciples.
I knew as soon as you said that, I knew you were going to say that. And I can definitely see it. That hadn't occurred to me until you started explaining it. And then I thought, Dwayne's going to say Last Supper. And you're exactly right. It's got that exact vibe, doesn't it?
I have to tell you, Aldrich was a genius at the way he would stage certain shots, the way he would film them, and the way it was edited. Another favorite sequence, and I got to tell Clint Walker this, that when I was a little kid and I first saw The Dirty Dozen, that scene scared the hell out of me, where he's about to stab Marvin with the knife because Marvin took the scabbard off and he keeps goading him. The way Robert Aldrich built the suspense there, the way the edits were done, where the cuts are coming more and more, quicker, where you see the reaction and you see Richard Jacob reach for his sidearm until finally Walker loses it. Stop pushing! When I was a kid, I ran under the table. It scared the hell out of me because he's a frightening looking guy when he gets mad.
Huge fella.
He's an imposing guy, isn't he?
And I got to tell Clint Walker that, and he laughed and he went, "Oh, thank you." Then the scene worked. That's what we were going for.
Great.
But yeah, I love that scene.
It's a good one. It is good, and it's another scene where like it just cements Lee Marvin as being this like double hard, larger than life, just cool as guy. So he's fearless. That's the whole thing I get from him.
And he knows the buttons he's pushing, doesn't he?
Oh, sure.
In that scene, and it points it out.
There are things that were in the book that were rather lengthy because it's like a 500-page novel. And there were things that are in the book that didn't necessarily go into the film because it would be too lengthy, but instead they kind of did it in a compacted version. And that would be a real good example of that. Because in the book, they go. The author Nathanson goes into the background of every one of the dozen, how they wound up in, what the crime was they committed, what Reisman had to do to bring them around to become more of a team and a group and what have you. I think it was done brilliantly with just that Clint Walker scene, and things like that, as opposed to having hundreds of pages of dialogue explaining it.
We do get a couple where it's sort of the exposition is more straightforward, and he meets some of them in the cells, and there's some gorgeous cinematography of looking down through those grates where they're watching because they're on, I assume they're on suicide watch because they've taken their laces and stuff. And there's that scene with Jim Brown's character, and he explains that he was in like a racially motivated brawl. And that always strikes me like that's a very sort of contemporary, forward-thinking sort of scene to include in a war movie of this decade. Because, he explains that it was self-defense, basically, and it was a racially motivated fight for survival.
Well, I can tell you that one of the things in the film that Robert Aldrich did first was that he said, this is a really good movie for 1945, the script. This isn't 1945. It's going to come out in 1967. I want it to feel more contemporary. And so several other writers worked on it, including the one who got the credit, Lucas Heller. And one of the best things about The Dirty Dozen, one of the things that makes it last as long as it has, is just exactly what you spoke of. When you hear Jim Brown say, when Lee Marvin says, don't you want to kill Germans? They're the real master race merchants. And Jim Brown said, that's your war, Major, not mine. You want to kill Germans? You kill them. He was almost saying word for word exactly what got Muhammad Ali in trouble and lost his boxing license around the same time, because he didn't want to go to Vietnam. That's your war, not mine. And Aldrich was ingenious for putting that in the movie.
It's a powerful scene, and you kind of forget about it when you think about the Dirty Dozen, because you think of this ensemble cast that went on to such great things, and they all became household names, and it's such a men on a mission movie that you just think of the mission a lot of the time, and the initial build-up of the exposition around the characters and then the training is just something that you don't always think of when you think Dirty Dozen. You think Chateau, you think about that scene where Lee Marvin's on the roof and there's the confrontation with Robert Ryan and a few others, but that is a powerful scene, and I just think that it's interesting that Aldrich thought we should put this into something that is popular media. You
betcha. And it is of the time, and it's lasted from that time. Another thing that I love about the film in terms of themes is how it's not, I wouldn't go so far as to call the movie pro-war in its point of view, other than it's pro-war in the sense that there's a lot of action in it and a lot of the enemy gets killed.
Yeah.
True. However, because of the time in which the film was made, at the almost major escalation of the Vietnam War, there was a lot of anti-war and anti-military feelings in the society as a whole. And Aldrich was once again very smart to include that in the film. There's a brilliant scene early on when Marvin is meeting with Robert Webber and Borgnine and Robert Ryan, and and George Kennedy is there. And Marvin takes a stand about what they made him do. They made him witness an execution, and he doesn't like it. And he said, that's no way to die. Yeah. And Borgnine says, oh, the hell you say? I know a lot of soldiers that should be killed just that way. And he laughs. And because he laughs, everybody at the table laughs, right? Because he's in charge. He's the general. He's like the CEO of the company. And it's Aldrich's way of showing the military is like big business. That you got to kiss the boss's ass. You got to do what he says. You got to laugh when he laughs. You got to yes him to death. All that stuff. And it's a brilliant way to show how anti-military and anti-authoritative first Marvin's character is, and all the other characters that he's in charge of. And that's probably one of the reasons why he got chosen to do the mission. He's a renegade, right?
Yeah.
And so consequently, they figure a renegade would know how to get renegades to do what he wants.
Plus, they can get rid of him on this suicide mission too.
And that sense in the film of being anti-authoritative and anti-military, that really resonated with audiences in 1967. It was a movie that World War II veterans liked, and it's a movie that draft age young men liked, and so consequently, it's like that thing I always felt about the movie Patton that you mentioned a moment ago. The thing about Patton, aside from being a great movie, if you have the point of view of being a hawk, that you're very pro-military, you'll love that movie. If you have the point of view of being a dove and a pacifist, you'll love that movie. And the fact that movie was able to walk that dividing line brilliantly is one of the things I loved about the film. Feel the same way about The Dirty Dozen, except The Dirty Dozen is a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Violent.
Yeah.
There's no other word for it. It's a lot more violent.
A lot more like very macho.
Right? The rumor is that John Wayne was first offered the lead role.
Yeah, I read that, yeah.
And he turned it down because he didn't like seeing so many innocent people being killed at the end of the film. Not just the German officers, but their women, okay?
Their wives and, yeah.
Yeah.
When Marvin read the script, he goes, I got no problem with that at all. It's
Wow.
kind of, if they're so innocent, what are they doing hanging around with Nazis,
I mean, the only way they could have made that scene worse is by having kids in
they
there.
didn't, yeah. Because that's one thing that sticks with me. Like, I'm like, that ending there, herding them all into that small area, then setting them on fire is very, very shocking. But then,
and once again, you want to talk about a metaphor? What did the Germans do to the Jews?
That's exactly what I was just about to say. It's
not an accident.
There's an allegory there. Yeah.
When he tells Richard Bowen to get the gasoline, and Bowen questions it, he goes, "Gasoline? Are you sure, sir?" And Marvin, shouts at him, "You want to ask Pinkley and Vladek? Now get going." They had just been killed.
Ah, yes, of course.
The snipers had just killed them, and it's his way of saying, "Look, they're killing us. We got to kill them."
I mean, we should probably talk about that scene because that wasn't, initially the plan, was it? That they weren't going to head them all down there and pour gasoline on them, but.
When they get locked in, Bronson says to Marvin, "You didn't think about that, did you?" And Marvin goes, "They got to breathe, don't they?"
Yeah.
It's almost as if he had in mind.
Yeah.
Thinking on their feet.
Action line, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
The shot, again, it's one of those sort of bird's eye view shots.
Oh, my God. That shot of Jim Brown dropping the grenades in and he's smiling and giggling.
That some of those are the most powerful parts of that scene.
And when Bronson empties the gas tank and he's smiling and he tosses it in the air like a toy balloon, it's as if they're saying, "We're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to really enjoy this." It's so sick.
It's like their sadistic side comes out. It's the subtle reminders every now and then that they are criminals. They are not. They're not like you and me, sort of thing.
Yeah, they're psychopaths. Some of them.
It almost gives away why they were chosen, because they were able to do this. Goes back to what I asked before.
Yeah,
they don't have that moral thing.
I mean, there is precedent during the war of gasoline being used on holdouts that wouldn't come out of situations like that.
On the Japanese islands.
That scene, to me, the whole chateau sequence, we mentioned earlier the Suicide Squad, but obviously another film that it massively sort of inspires.
Inglourious Bastards.
That whole climax of that movie is sort of a pastiche, really, isn't it, of the Dirty Dozen's climax? The theatre matching the opulence of the chateau, but it's the method of killing the Nazis, the fire from the burning film. I suppose it's a nice homage, really.
Absolutely, it is. The amount of other projects that Dirty Dozen inspired is a very, very long list. I mentioned a moment ago the Devil's Brigade, the TV show The A-Team. Oh my gosh, so many off the top of my head. I can't. Well, Suicide Squad, as you just mentioned, but there were so many more.
Force 10 from Navarone.
There's a great man on a mission. And I don't know if you remember this or not, or know about this, but there was a short-term TV show, a short-lived TV show in America a year after The Dirty Dozen was released. It was called Garrison's Gorillas, and it was a It was a spin-off from the TV show Combat, but the
We
premise
love Combat
was
on the show.
Oh, so do I. I used to watch it with my dad. It was one of my favorite shows.
It's so good.
But that premise in Garrison's Guerrillas was identical to Dirty Dozen. They had a main officer recruit all these hardened criminals to go on secret missions. I liked the show. I thought it was cool.
Yeah. There was a short-lived TV series of Dirty Dozen as well in the late 80s as well.
Yes, there was. Yes. Starred Ben Murphy. And I always thought it was funny when they did the TV movie sequels. Marvin was in the first one, and then the next two, they brought back Telly Savalas. A whole different character, but they brought him back.
Me and Matt are doing that one next week, so we're really looking forward to sort of seeing the big change.
Well, it's interesting. For my book, I was able to interview his son. Wonderful guy.
Okay.
Unfortunately, he passed away, but he told me what his father really thought of the sequel. And I'm not going to tell you. You got to read the book because he has a great take about the sequel. And just to show you what a Dirty Dozen fan I am, have you guys ever seen this?
Oh, wow. So for the listeners, Dwayne's holding up a vinyl of the soundtrack.
Yes, indeed. And look how they did a little drawing.
Look at that.
Oh, very nice. I like
it.
Love it.
So they did.
He sings the Bramble Bush, ladies and gentlemen.
Of course. Yeah. So I think that brings us on to final thoughts this week. I mean, Dwayne, you're our guest, please. Your final thoughts on the Dirty Dozen.
It's a classic for a reason, and classics are classics because they've stood the test of time. Some movies you watch and you kind of cringe a little bit going, did they really say that? Or did they really do that? Or that's hokey, or that's lame. I don't think there's any sequence like that in the Dirty Dozen. Everything stands up and holds up well. And people like myself who have seen it so many times, we still have questions about it. People ask, how come they didn't show what happened to Clint Walker's character at the end of the film?
That's one of my
apparently
questions.
Clint Walker told me that when he read the script initially, as they did in the book, he was going to have a sequence where he rips off most of his clothes and puts on war paint and does a war dance as he gets killed. But he said Robert Aldrich had hired Jim Brown because of his ability as an athlete, and he figured if he's going to be running and runs like a son of a bitch. If he's going to be running, doing that and highlighting that sequence, okay, they're not going to have time for the war dance.
I mean, I'm kind of glad they didn't do that, really.
So am I. And Posey didn't make it because when they do that crawl at the end, showing that everybody who died, you see Clint Walker among them.
Yeah.
But my final thought, it's one hell of a movie. It's probably, if it's not my top 5, it's in my top 10 favorites. And I've been a movie fan my whole life. Yeah.
Is it your favorite war movie?
Easy answer, yes, without question.
There you go.
Thought it might be.
Matt, your final thoughts?
I really love the performances. I love Telly's psychopathic, absolutely detestable character. And I just love the fact that you can sit there going, God, I hate this guy. And that's a good performance when you sit there and you go, God, I hate Telly Savalas because he's that scary in this movie. I love Lee in it. I love Bronson. I love Jim Brown. It's a great cast. And for me, it some of the scenes are a little long. Like you could trim some of the fat because it's 150 minutes long. That might be a controversial thing. And that might be something that I think some of the original reviews said, Dwayne, you mentioned that earlier, I think.
Yeah, a couple of reviews I found said it was a tad long, but they could see where they were going with it, sort of thing.
And it's all a matter of opinion, but I got to tell you, I never thought that way about the movie. It's one of those movies where even though it runs almost 3 hours long, it doesn't feel that way to me. It feels like a 20-minute film. And then there are movies that are like an hour and a half. It feels like you've been watching it for days and days. It goes at such a great pace.
True.
It's so well done.
It is. It's well shot and it's beautifully directed with some of those scenes. And it launched, a whole raft of anti-hero movies and men on a mission movies and that whole sort of genre of, obviously there were men on a mission movies beforehand, but this is the one that everyone sort of like thinks that he doesn't. And it's a great movie. And I'm looking forward to covering the rest of the franchise.
Yeah, really am.
Later this month. But yeah, so Rob, what do you think?
To be fair, I mean, I first saw it when I was very young and I enjoyed it. I rewatched it over Christmas last year, and I think I was either just a bit too tired or had maybe few too many beers, but I thought it was a bit long. And then I rewatched it, obviously for the show. Initially, I was like, struggling to get from scene to scene, but I went back and I watched individual scenes on their own to analyze them a little bit more for the show. And I've mellowed on my opinion because, I think actually technically it's really well done. It's written really well. Everyone's putting in 110%. It's just me personally, I think I don't like an overly long film, but obviously the way that I consume films as a 27-year-old is completely different to how someone consumed movies back in 67.
Right.
So it's just a matter of opinion for me. But you can't not love the film, I think. It's one of those classics. Everyone loves it. Lee Marvin's just so likable. There's something for everyone in that film, I think. It's just one of those.
I think the fact that it's repeated on TV so frequently still
it is. Yeah, I mean,
there's
a
testament to it as well.
A channel over here, our listeners will know, it's ITV4, and they play it. I mean, it must be every other week, really, I think. Yeah.
There's a cable station here in the States called Turner Classic Movies. It's owned by Ted Turner. They show it at least once every month or two.
Yeah.
I'm guessing it's one of Ted Turner's favorite films.
It must
That's
be.
why they showed it.
And everyone always sort of is excited about talking about it and hearing about it, and it always gets the fact it's still getting referenced now in the movie industry. As I said with James Gunn talking about it, that just shows you how much of an impact it's made.
We're celebrating Dirty Dozen December with a unique custom designed t-shirt featuring none other than Lee Marvin's iconic character. What could bring more festive cheer than Lee Marvin in a Santa hat, grease gun in hand? Pick up yours today over at fightingonfilm.com.
If I may, I'd like to end with this one anecdote, which is very, very true. My best friend and I, when we were, as I said earlier, when home video came out in the late 70s, early 80s, one of the first movies I bought was The Dirty Dozen. And if we didn't have anything going on that night, my buddy Mike would call me up and say, "What are you doing?" And I would say, "Not much." And he'd say, "You want to watch The Dirty Dozen?" And he'd come over and we'd watch it. And it got to the point, I'm not exaggerating this, it got to the point where he would call me and he wouldn't say anything. I would pick up the phone and I would hear somebody go, "Soom, doom, da 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 da, bum, ba, ba, da, ba." And I would go, "All right, come on over."
I love it.
And we'd watch The Dirty Dozen.
Thanks everyone for listening, and Dwayne, thank you so much for joining us. Your insight's been absolutely phenomenal. And if anyone is looking for a Christmas gift, please consider getting the film fan in your life, Dwayne's book, Lee Marvin's Point Blank. I think it'll be a great little stocking filler. And thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you. And just so you know, anybody wants to know more, I didn't give away that much about the making of The Dirty Dozen. There's a whole lot more I'm finding out every day. And if you want to know about it, get Killing General.
Yes, please do.
It's coming out soon.
Well, we'll have to have you back on when it comes out, Dwayne. You can give us the inside line.
I'd love to be on. Thank you.
And yes, catch us next week, everyone, when we'll be tackling Dirty Dozen, the next mission. Happy Christmas, everybody, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.